Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm like, what? And used to doing this in the evening. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming to our lecture today with Jenni Sorkin. My name is Rachel Adams. I'm the Chief Curator and Director of Programs here at BMIS. And it's lovely to see all of your faces. Before we get started, I just wanted to do a little bit of not housekeeping, but upcoming. We have a few things upcoming. In the next few weeks, we have Claire Rousset coming for a low-end show on Thursday night, which is going to be amazing. And you all need to go and tell me how it is, because unfortunately I won't be here. But very excited about Claire coming to Omaha. Our exhibitions up here are open for another week, so they close next Sunday on the 14th. So please spend some time in the exhibitions if you haven't already. And then our next few low-end shows that are after that, May 2nd with Holland Andrews, May 9th with Ben Vita and Yarnwire, which is going to be really great. And then on May 18th, we'll open 2 new exhibitions on this floor. We'll have Raven Half Moon, Flags of Our Mothers, which is really a wonderful show that I co-curated with Amy Smith-Stewart from the Aldrich. So it'll be opening here. And then Paul Stephen Benjamin, Black of Night, which will be also a solo exhibition. So the 2 of them will be here on the 18th. So please come meet them and see their shows. And then we'll have tons of programming for all of that too. But it's not in my head yet, so can't tell you about it. And then also I just wanted to thank the Women's Fund for being our community partner on this lecture. If you're not familiar, you can visit the table after the lecture. The Women's Fund works on the most critical challenges facing anyone who experiences gender-based oppression in Nebraska by identifying issues through research, funding solutions by investing grant money in local nonprofits, and leading dynamic change by advocating for effective policy solutions. Since 1990, the Women's Fund has provided more than $56 million in grants to programs working on addressing the most crucial issues identified by their research. We, as in the Women's Fund, are the only local foundation that provides grants exclusively to programs addressing gender-based inequities, and we are the leading organization researching issues impacting anyone who experiences gender-based oppression. The research looks at intersectional issues including economic conditions, access to sexual health, education and health services, domestic violence, and the status of women's leadership. They have petitions for paid sick leave and protecting abortion rights available to sign at the table. And then they're also doing a tribute fundraising campaign, which invites you to join them as they honor those working to make the world better for women and girls, crush on the ones who are creating real change in our community. Uplift those who always cheer you on and celebrate those who refuse to settle for the status quo. This is what the Tribute Fundraising Campaign is all about: women supporting women, allies uplifting advocates, and friends shining a light on their rock star peers. For $55 per person, you can recognize a local hero of your own in their fall issue of today's Omaha Women, and for $200, you can list your hero on the Women's Fund window for the entire year. And it gets even better. This year, your tribute donation will be matched dollar for dollar up to $10,000 thanks to an anonymous donor. So really amazing foundation, organization, so please check them out after the talk. Okay, wait, I have more. I'm super excited to have Jenni here because it took 3 times to get her here. We had some weather issues, and we're even still having some weather issues with the wind today, but we're all here in this room, and it's great. So thank you for being here again, Jenni, and visiting our residents while you're also giving this lecture. I'm going to let you dive into the lecture, but I just wanted to read your amazing bio. Jenni Sorkin is a professor of history of art and architecture at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She writes on the intersections between gender, material culture, and contemporary art, working primarily on women artists and underrepresented media. Her books include Live Form, Women, Ceramics, and Community from the University of Chicago, 2016, Revolution in the Making, Abstract Sculpture by Women Artists, 1947 to 2016, which is also in 2016, and Art in California, 2021, as well as numerous essays in journals and exhibition catalogs. She received her PhD in History of Art from Yale University and is a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Modern Craft. From 2021 to 2022, she was the senior scholar in residence at the Getty Research Institute in Los Angeles. She also serves as the co-executive editor of Panorama, the Association of Historians of American Art, and currently doing a fellowship at the Smithsonian. Please welcome Jenni Sorkin.
Thank you all for coming out, and thank you so much, Rachel, for persevering. Third time's a charm. I'm really thrilled I made it to Omaha. I am also a fellow Midwesterner. I'm from Chicago originally, but have never been to Omaha, except to drive through the state, on my way somewhere else. All right. So thank you all for coming on this warm, windy Saturday. Thank you, Rachel, for inviting me. Thank you to all the Bemis residents. I'm really glad to get to see your work, talk to you, and see this residency program, which I've followed for a really long time. So I'm at the beginning of a new book project, which is on textile histories, and it is tentatively titled Deviant Scale, Cloth at the Body's Margins. It's about the 1990s and the intersection between textile-driven sculpture and identity politics. And so that's the perspective from which I'm talking. And I'm also really invested in thinking about regional spaces in this book, which are historically marginalized and forgotten and overlooked, and also do so much good work in this country for advancing the careers of artists, and also championing contemporary art, and also ideas around difference and alterity in spaces that don't always have that programming or have the ability to think about difference and diversity. I feel like contemporary art does that work as from a kind of activist perspective in these regional spaces around the country. So with that, I'm gonna give my paper. During the 1990s, thematic, textile-driven exhibitions in the US became a primary means of disseminating identity-driven forms of artistic practice as a way to delve deeply into a visual argument by amassing content from a broad range of practitioners that coalesced around a central idea. Self-expression, ritual, embodiment, suggestive technique, even scale, became some of the overarching ideas that defined the era. As artist Beverly Semmes has noted, Charles Ledre and I would always be in a room together, as a way of commenting on scale, very big and very small. In particular, curators working at university museums, alternative spaces, and regional contemporary art centers sought to connect with their audiences through topical yet relatable themes as a means of transforming the viewing experience from one of passive contemplation into a space of active outreach, dialogue, and community building. One of the key considerations I wish to chart in this project is a clearer understanding of the ways in which regionalism provides less a backdrop than a backbone to contemporary sculptural practices throughout the 1990s, bolstering its exhibition and circulation away from the coastal centers of New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. Regionalism has long been associated with a particular brand of pre-World War II American painting. Artists such as Grant Wood, John Stuart Curry, and Thomas Hart Benton, who participated in what art historian Lauren Croix has described as New Deal productive citizenry. But as I will argue, 1990s regional curatorial practice also figures strongly as an era of what we might call culture wars productive citizenry. This is because such programming required diplomacy and care, particularly in regions of the nation marked by social or cultural conservatism, underpinned by the spreading influence of evangelical and fundamentalist Christian organizations that waded deeply into local and national politics, such as Focus on the Family in Colorado, Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, seen here in North Carolina, and the American Family Association in Mississippi. It is also worth pointing out the close proximity to one of the major funders in the field of American craft, the Center for Craft, located in Asheville, North Carolina, which has sponsored numerous diversity initiatives over the last 10 years. This is especially relevant now, given the neo-culture wars happening all across a bevy of southern states and western states. This time, homophobia and anti-AIDS activism has given way to rampant transphobia and racist anti-diversity screeds about critical race theory and diversity initiatives in higher education. A series of political battles over morality, the culture wars was an expression popularized by the sociologist James Davidson Hunter, who published an influential book in 1991 titled Culture Wars: The Struggle to Define America, which argues that public culture, to a larger extent than any other facet of life in this republic, is the place where US citizens settle symbolically what it means to be an American, where the limits of personal behavior and collective action are set, sometimes in opposition to each other, and where notions of civic duty and a greater public good are represented. For Hunter, public culture provides a repository for collective myth-making, surrounding our disparate and unified histories and our special national brand of optimism for a different or better future. Therefore, control of public culture in the US stands as the ultimate legitimization of a group's beliefs. Hunter outlines 5 areas in American life where the culture wars raged with particular ferocity: the family, education, media and the arts, law, and electoral politics. These topics are wide-ranging, covering everything from abortion and birth control to discussions of homosexuality and free speech. If this cacophony of public argument and even hostile, violent dissent seems familiar in 2024, that is because we are once again living what I am calling a neo-culture wars moment. Topics that once felt settled, or at least decided, are now having a resurgence. That is why I'm engaging in this work, to try to understand the material turn in the 1990s as a strategy of stealth dissent that took nearly 2 decades to fully circulate and dismantle art world media hierarchies. Now, artists with no textile training or background, like Zoe Buckman, are able to successfully appropriate the medium itself, engaging in a dialogue familiar to audiences such as all of you here, using the material support of found lingerie embroidered with often misogynist hip-hop lyrics to engage criticality and question around the role that being the object of desire plays in the formation of female identity. But between our current moment and the 1990s, there are still some key differences. 30 years ago, there was no Fox News. There was no social media. There was no internet. This was a pre-digital moment when information traveled at a much slower rate of exchange. Given the widespread skepticism and lack of exposure to contemporary art, particularly by a working class or non-college educated populace, combined with conservative politics, I will argue that textile-driven shows were conceived specifically as a bridge, a means of offering a beloved and familiar material framework: quilts, blankets, clothing, rags, and the like, as an approachable space for audiences to access and participate, perhaps for the first time, in the burgeoning discourse of 1990s era multiculturalism. Or put another way, textiles became a way to experience contemporary art without the fear and alienation that many people felt then as now when looking at media-based art of the same era. photography, film, and video. Black box culture, a darkened room, a looped video on a screen, text emblazoned, large-scale photographs, all of these were profoundly foreign encounters. Textiles, then, were a democratic medium that offered a workaround, avoiding the looming potential of igniting a culture wars era controversy in a regional locale. In this shared space of public discourse, then, textiles became one of the primary metaphors for corporeal and bodily subject matter, broadly encompassing themes of domesticity, self-fashioning, and gender performance. By no means exhaustive, such issues might more closely examine the following content I've offered in brainstorm format that I'm just going to share with you here. And these are some of the bigger hitting issues that artists seemed to be working on in the 90s. Again, many of which are recurring in the present. It feels like there isn't this 30-year gap when we think about embodiment in the self, fetishism, ritual, ceremony, featherwork, beading, native regalia, ethnic, racialized, and classed histories of dress, social codes, code switching, conditioning, dressing up, dressing down, transgressive gender, genderqueer, drag, cross-dressing, public versus private, personas, uniform, labor work, labor-intensive hand-based processes such as weaving, sewing, embroidery, fantasy, costuming, play, cosplay, the idealized feminine form, techniques of structure and control, bodices, boning, corsets, straps, girdles, lacing, hypersexualized or required forms of dress such as bikinis, lingerie, leotards, swimwear, cheerleaders, waitressing uniforms, codpieces, coming of age, prom, quinceañera, debutante dresses, suggestive technique, hook and eye, knots, interlacing, pleats, slits, hyperfemininity, princess play, ball gowns, frills, lace, taffeta, sparkle, lace, fragility, pre-industrial labor, ethnic revival, leather, BDSM, bondage, cowboy and girl culture, horses, saddles, bridles, fringe, suede, domesticity and the culture of care, aprons, wash rags, nappies, towels, linen, bed sheets, tablecloths, clotheslines, ironing, laundry starch, bleach, wrinkles, stains, placemats, potholders. I had a lot of fun coming up with this list. And there's probably more. Such content held the capacity for deep personal and social resonance on the part of audiences who encountered these shows within learning environments. As primary centers of culture in rural states, non-coastal cities, and suburbia, the University Art Museum and Regional Art Center became ideal venues at which to stage such exhibitions. These galleries also count as Kunsthalle spaces, that is, museums and art spaces that were without permanent collections or very limited ones, relying entirely on rotating exhibitions to make up a whole season or academic year of exhibition and educational programming. In strong opposition to New York gallery culture and its nearly exclusive focus on white male painters, these thematic shows exist as a parallel world, offering important early opportunities to women and artists of color. Non-commercial and often laden with theoretical ideologies, group exhibitions across the era of 1985 to 2000 were adventurous, playful, and confrontational, flouting the careful, solicitous tones that museums adopted during the American culture wars, and instead encouraging artistic explorations in mixed media sculpture and large-scale, sometimes one-off installations that utilized the textile as a central component. Discursive dress, the social fabric, and empty dress, catalog covers of which you see here, are endemic to the 1990s. They showcase the growing confidence and fluency with using and referencing mix and match continental philosophy, literary criticism, and art history, or what is often called in art departments globally, theory. That is, the disciplinary mashup of frameworks and underpinnings for conceptual art making. In discursive dress, Alison Ferris, its curator, immediately acknowledges the influence of Michel Foucault on the title itself, taken from his notion of discursive formations, in the title of his second chapter in his 1969 book, The Archaeology of Knowledge, which acknowledges a simultaneous approach to history, and in particular, archives, to looking both forward and backward historically when approaching knowledge production. Ferris's archive is clothing, or as she describes it, quote, clothing as an ideal form in which to pursue an aesthetic exploration of political issues, end quote. Ferris included a roster of 12 artists, both male and female: Michelle Blondell, Maureen Connor, David Eckhart, Jessie Good, Pamela Quiche, Elizabeth Leister, Christine LaFasso, Naomi London, Sharon McConnell, Young Soo Min, Cameron Shaw, Alan Wexler. Maureen Connor was the best known of the group, the most senior artist living and showing in New York, included in a bevy of landmark 1990s exhibitions: the 1993 Whitney Biennial, also included in Empty Dress, and as well in Sexual Politics, the performance theorist Amelia Jones's 1996 meditation on feminist art. For her inclusion in the Whitney Biennial, Connor's mixed media work had actually already been exhibited elsewhere, showcased as the sole New York artist in a 1992 group exhibition held at Randolph Street Gallery, an alternative space in Chicago. Titled Speak, and curated by two emerging photo-based artists, Lynn Brown and Jin Lee, the exhibition focused on issues of speaking, investigating, and redefining language, and amplifying the idea of the voice as a form of empowerment. Ensemble for Three Female Voices from 1990, an image of which you see here, was constructed using lipstick casts of the tongue and larynx, steel stands, sound, and curtains with variable dimensions. From what I can piece together from images and the press release, Connor created a cloistered environment for her sculptures using curtains from which recorded, disembodied voices emanated. The fact that this installation was lifted wholesale from Chicago and exported to the Whitney Biennial supports my general thesis. Regional thematic exhibitions were key supports for artists to gain national traction and attention. This is very different than our current moment, in which the solo exhibition dominates. Unless a show is a regional specific biennial, such as the Cleveland Triennial or Greater New York or the Hammer Biennial, we are currently in a climate in which it is much, much harder to find support for a thematic group show with a roster full of emerging artists. I'll offer a recent example: an exhibition called This Mortal Coil, a group show of 17 contemporary artists held at the Zuckerman Museum of Kennesaw State University in suburban Atlanta. Its curator, Cynthia Norse Thompson, serves in dual capacities. She is, as a printmaker, teaching in the art department, but her primary job is to program the university's art museum. The show's archaic title invoked a direct quote from Hamlet and sought to interrogate the process of grief in close proximity to loss and isolation during COVID. It included several works by Janine Antoni and Ann Wilson, as well as a long list of emerging artists, but was largely anchored by an anachronistic Sleight of Hand, a mixed media installation by the Philadelphia artist Martha McDonald. The weeping dress that you see here delves deeply into Victorian cultural history, creating a period-specific mourning dress that literally weeps, releasing the black dye onto the floor around it, leaving a heavy stain indicative of the dark plight of its wearer. The dress itself becomes a sentient being that cannot hold back, discharging its dye as a metaphor of emotional release. McDonald's dress stains the floor rather than the wearer. That is, the mourner cannot absorb the trauma, and it literally runs, flooding the environment, mining a female trope of hysteria, overwrought and uncontained. In her materials-based research, MacDonald found that women were instructed not to wear any light reflective fabrics in their first year of mourning, and the wool bombazine, a silk and wool blend or crepe, popular for mourning garb, did not absorb plant-based dyes, and thus in heat or rain, their own bodies would be stained and streaked with shades of black and blue, akin to bruising, an outward ideation of trauma, especially apparent on white skin, further highlighting the intense whiteness of the Victorian era itself, the dominance of the British Empire, and its extractive and exploitive histories in its myriad and far-flung global colonies. I wrote for this catalog, for a show hardly anyone saw, but the reason was not just COVID. It is not only difficult to find financial support, particularly in a time of diminished corporate sponsorships, but it is also hard to find critical support. It received a local thumbs up from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. But the point is this: a group show bringing together far-flung work, a time-consuming and expensive process, could come to fruition, but then potentially not get any traction in the national press. This is because galleries seek to control the narrative of reviewed content. Profit-driven magazines like Artforum and Art in America rely heavily on advertising revenue. Blue-chip art galleries like Gagosian, Zorner, and Pace are at the forefront of bolstering such enterprises with full-paged ads. A full-page ad might not yield a review in every single issue, but it does exert a permanent kind of anxiety upon editors, and in turn, their roster of stringers, writers who review regularly but are not on salary. But to return to discursive dress, the other artists included in this exhibition were largely emerging artists at the time of this show. While some have vanished, others went on to distinguished teaching careers, such as Christine LaFasso, whose work is featured on the cover of the catalog, who taught for the entirety of her career at Northern Illinois University. I found in papers, actually, that were lovely. Rachel provided me a bunch of boxes because I asked to go through some of the archives while I'm here. And Christine LaFasso actually had a solo show here in 2005, which I was very happy to see. Naomi London taught at Dawson College in Montreal, David Eckhart at Willamette University in Oregon, and Young Soo Min, who taught at UC Irvine for the entirety of her career and just passed away last month. It is important to emphasize these early inclusions were crucial to their artistic success, securing tenure and therefore permanent employment through proof of an ongoing exhibition record. If an exhibition record could pave the way to tenure, an absolute mandate for the professionalizing teaching artist, curating had looser requirements, much less professionalized 30 years ago at that juncture than it is now. By and large, 1990s thematic group shows were organized by women practitioners, many in the first decades of their careers, and a number who worked in an interdisciplinary fashion, transferring from arts administration or art making to curating, or doing all three simultaneously, finding themselves tasked with administrative or curatorial responsibilities in their first teaching positions. One of the major themes across the 1990s was the idea of cloth as a stand-in for a collection of body parts, or what I will call the fragmented body, a form that is a fragment rather than a whole. Maureen Connor's cast larynx and tongue certainly fits this bill. Fragmentation is one of the core concepts of modernity. Urbanism and its overwhelming sensory experiences, such as window shopping, nightlife, and the culture of cinema, created a century of fragmented bodies, inattention, and lack of wholeness as a consequence of new forms of visuality. For instance, seeing a glimpse of one's image in the side mirror of a parked car, or jump cuts within an action movie. The female body in particular has been subjected to fragmentary, often eroticized treatments in art and cinema. Yet this condition of the incomplete, the not whole, is in parts more suggestive and more subtle than wholeness itself. In the catalog for American art today, Clothing as Metaphor, the New York-based art critic Kay Larson appropriates the French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty's idea of the painter, male of course, lending his body to the world. In her brief catalog essay, she configures the gender and the medium ascribed. The artist of the 1990s has lent her body to the world and is far more aware of it than her predecessors 100 years ago. She is, if anything, hyper-conscious of her body and bodies in general as a repository of identities, social, sexual, role-playing, culturally molded, highly complex identities. She is aware also that these identities are not easily come by and they are not easily shed. The unnerving déjà vu in this exhibition comes from the feeling that we have already worn these clothes somehow. We have already experienced what they can tell. These ghostly remnants of prior knowledge create a sense of recognition. We are given license to think about ourselves at a distance, end quote. One of the early practitioners of this sort of work was Judith Shea, who was included in many of the shows discussed here today, including Clothing as a Metaphor. Her 1989 work that you see here, Venus, appropriates the headless torso of classical female sculpture, again, a fragmented body, and pairs it with a simple, clean, white shift dress, offering the double entendre of the words classic and classical, terms used repeatedly to characterize this particular mid-century tunic, a dress popularized by Jackie Kennedy, Twiggy, and a host of other 60s-era fashion icons. But the other witty joke here is with regard to the sleeve. The dress itself was initially considered revealing because of its sleeveless quality, eroticizing the bare, shapely arms of its wearer. Here, sleeveless takes on a new consideration as the sculpture itself is fully lacking arms. In our era of extreme sensitivity to difference, it is possible that a new generation of viewer might take offense to such a proposition, further perpetuated in a male version known as Apollo, that also lays claim to the bodily fragment, offering only a partial tunic for a one-armed god who is literally disarmed. Again, the double entendre and witty punning, a man who cannot perform, in that Apollo was the god of archery and music. For Shea, clothing becomes a metaphoric textile in perfect alignment with the ancient world. She inherits and embraces the bodily fragment from the classical world and fully extends its sensual oddity as a natural occurrence and metaphor that mocks the idea of a timeless past by pairing her bodies with specific garments. The sculptures cease to be revered objects of worship, set within temple architecture, site at which historic people might have left offerings, and even some into the present. See, for instance, the famed Athena statue at Bryn Mawr College, goddess of wisdom, worshipped by generations of students. Shea takes ancient sculpture down a notch, treating its form not just as a headless goddess, but as a mannequin or dress form that performs as a space on which to literally hang our own cultural ideologies of beauty, status, class, and sophistication. Other artists absconded from fashion entirely. The fragmented body as a ritualized object became one of the clear points of departure for other artists of her own generation. Here, for instance, in a very early work by Kiki Smith, Ribs, from 1987, a sculpted mixed media clay work seemingly held together by the gossamer precarity of pink thread, hanging in fine wisps from the rib cage, as weightless as breathing itself. While Judith Shea humanizes the ancients, Smith's work is more directly and specifically human, a metaphor for the precarity of the body. Made at the height of the AIDS crisis, when there were no treatments to hasten the progression of HIV into full-blown AIDS, the lungs of its victims were particularly vulnerable, afflicted with bacteria infections, pneumonia, and other conditions that hindered breathing and created generalized weakness. Smith's work takes on particular resonance in relation to her own biography. She lost her younger sister, Bibi, an actress, to AIDS the year after in 1988. By the 1990s, feminism had already triumphed within the academy. In the early 90s, a spate of books coming out of performance studies, comp lit, and gender studies became key texts imported into art history. After Judith Butler's Gender Trouble, they were eminently more accessible in that they provided real examples, engaging with artistic practice and process, and were unabashed in their love of descriptive and corporeal forms of writing, relishing the texture of language as a descriptor. This means that the cutting-edge humanist work was not coming from art history. How could it? Contemporary art history was in its infancy. Its first generation of academics, newly minted in the 1990s, fresh-faced young Octoberites, disciples of Rosalind Krauss, Yves Allenbois, and Benjamin Buchloh, all still fawning over Duchamp. Art history was a curmudgeonly discipline that was only talking to itself, its own version of feminism rewarding conceptual artists who were also able to fully articulate themselves in writing, penning stunning theoretical treatises, such as those by Sylvia Kolblowski, Adrian Piper, Yvonne Rainer, Carolee Schneemann. However, alongside the burgeoning field of literary-inflected performance studies and gender studies, the body and explorations in materiality were twin subjects that loomed large in the American artistic psyche. Cloth became a popular and suggestive substrate for approximating the folds of skin, or as a metaphor for the body politic. This was a moment when more established artists like Robert Gober and Kiki Smith herself began to gain traction. And one of the words used to describe their art was the term abject, which registers an aesthetic of bodily disgust. Initially used by the psychoanalytic French theorist Julia Kristeva to designate art based on the image of the human body, but specifically the body fragmented and decayed or represented by one of its socially transgressive or scatological functions. In depicting what most people would rather not see, the theory goes, art breaks through societal taboos, especially those surrounding sexuality and the scatological. And indeed, in the art of the 1990s, a certain level of beautiful revulsion was achieved. Dirt, bodily fluids, loose hair, excrement, and a general ooze came to sculptural practice. The abject became a much bandied about terminology. This was, again, pre-internet, and small exhibition catalogs were still prized and circulated. Indeed, one of the exhibitions that grew out of this exploration of the body was abject art, which was a show done by a crop of 4 emerging curators in the Whitney Independent Study Program in New York, 3 men and 1 woman, and whose catalog cover featured a Robert Gober leg. Essentially a student show drawing on the Whitney Museum's permanent collection, the show garnered a great deal of attention, including a New York Times review and a catalog that became early canonical reading in the burgeoning field of body-based sculptural practices that specifically addressed the AIDS crisis, queer abjection, suffering, and body-based object making. Some of the artists included in the exhibition were clear one-offs, not usually even associated with abjection, such as Gaston Lachaise or Jasper Johns. But others were included who are now routinely associated with a queer canon, such as Robert Rauschenberg, Robert Mapplethorpe, and Zoe Leonard, and a strong video program that included then-emerging artists such as Sadie Benning and Isaac Julian. However, in the parallel history of textile-based exhibition practice, Allison Ferris, now an independent curator, curated a group show titled Hair that debuted simultaneously to Corporeal Politics at the MIT List Center, so this catalog that I showed you here, and 6 months prior to Abject Art, in December of 1992 at the John Michael Kohler Art Center in Sheboygan, Wisconsin. Also note the overlapping lineup here between Corporeal Politics and Hair. Hair was Allison Ferris's first major exhibition at Kohler, having arrived an exile from a junior position with the National Endowment for the Arts, our only national funding agency for the arts, which had been dramatically cut back in the aftermath of the culture wars and her position eliminated. In her first curatorial position at a regional institution in Sheboygan, and without the contacts, network, or social capital to secure additional touring venues, Hair did not travel. Featuring works that utilized hair to comment on style and self-fashioning, fetishism, mourning, race, and other aspects of contemporary culture, it was a show far ahead of its time, and in particular, its place, as Sheboygan is a small industrial city of less than 50,000 residents. The main employer, the privately owned Kohler Company, manufactures porcelain toilets, sinks, showers, bathtubs, and other fixtures of domestic plumbing. Ruth Kohler was the original patron and benefactor of the Kohler Arts Center, establishing the museum in 1972 as a nonprofit to benefit the community, but also simultaneously anointed herself the first director. So when you're both patron and director, we know what those problems are. We can just predict. What was particularly ambitious was Ferris's desire to create continuity between the 19th and 20th centuries, creating an active historical framework for her exhibition. In Hair, she brought together two strains of hair work. The historical, including a large selection of 76 works of Victorian hair jewelry from a selection of private collections and historical societies that you see in the front in these two cases, including watch chains, friendship bracelets, brooches, and memory books. So these are the kinds of Victorian hair works that she would have mined from historical collections, as well as an array of works made by 19 living artists, majority women, whose work utilized hair to invoke memory, grief, longing, and desire. A national level show, the selection of works tended toward conceptual artworks rather than skill-driven practices. In Hair, the majority of its artists engaged in arrangement and contextualizing, that is, collecting, displaying, or photographing hair, such as Jean Dunning and Lorna Simpson, rather than working with it directly as an artistic material. Here, Dunning photographs the back of a woman's head, reducing her dyed red waves to an abstracted image as a means of denying the narrative pleasure and sex appeal that is a given in traditional portraiture of hair framing a woman's face. Simpson, on the other hand, collects her own frayed and split braids after her own hair once a year was braided and then cut. Sections of Black American hair are signposted with the terminology of enacting plaiting techniques upon the scalp and the monotony and repetition of the process itself. 1978, tangle, split, cut. 1982, tie, tear, knot, weave, tug. 1988, twist, part. Even artists with strong textile training, such as Ann Wilson, also worked closely with found hair and female beautification rituals around hair's upkeep and maintenance. The work on the left, Curled and Bleached, was included in the hair exhibition, while the work on the right, I Cut My Hair, shares a commonality with Simpson, yet with much less detail or cultural specificity. The fraught history of Black hairstyles, sometimes suppressed, other times celebrated, often exoticized, or the recipient of unwanted touching or commentary, elicits a far more loaded context than the simple ease of having so-called white hair, whose silky and buoyant texture dominates as a primary cultural aspiration in the realm of media and advertising, or what Beyoncé immortalized in her scathing album on infidelity, Lemonade, referring to her nemesis as Becky with the good hair. At this time, Wilson was simultaneously producing the sewn works that utilized the textile as a staging ground for hair. While she utilized table linens and damask cloth as her ground, these works were at time more specific than, for instance, the dowry cloth of Kiki Smith's that preceded her own work, Mourning Cloth. In Smith's work, wool and human hair are felted together, a process in which there is no sewing involved. Wilson's cloth, on the other hand, is made of linen, embellished with a fine carpet of dark, curly hair encircling a hole, which reads as a kind of orifice or bite, a particular savagery enacted. Both cloths becoming bodily in the process of making them hairy. They are no longer nude, they become living and uniquely abject entities with a tantalizingly repulsive sort of beauty. However, Wilson's work is much more carefully made. She is a consummate craftswoman with a careful eye and skill for the precise needlework she enacts upon her artworks. She has, for the majority of her career, utilized textile-based sculptural practices, experimenting with video and performance and glass, while Kiki Smith has worked also across a profusion of mediums and subjects, with a range of master craftspeople fabricating her work in print and craft materials such as tapestry and glass, as seen here. Wilson is long based in Chicago, Smith in New York. There are a host of other reasons why one and not the other, but the British craft writer Peter Dormer, who passed before the close of the 1990s, asked the following question before his untimely death that cuts to the heart of the matter for me. Quote, "Why is craft intellectually inconvenient in modern and contemporary art?" End quote. Or put another way, why was the artist's body continuously demoted when it performed skilled labor, but instead elevated when such labor appears as a conceptual strategy? This is one of the main ideas I am seeking to tease out in this new book project and understand the overlapping resonances and differences between where the art market and educational arenas diverged and where the regional became arguably more radical than the center. Thank you. I'm more than happy to have a conversation. There's a lot of artists in the room, and I'm certain that some of these ideas resonate with you. There's also curators in the room and just general people of general interest. So thoughts, ideas, comments, questions? What's my timeline? This has gone a little bit further back than the 90s because of the work I'm doing at the Smithsonian. I'm giving a keynote in conjunction with Woven Histories, which is Lynn Cook's sort of behemoth show on weaving that just opened at the National Gallery. And I've moved back in time to the 70s, and I realize that's probably my first chapter and starting point is actually thinking about ideas and histories of basketry. So this might end up being like a 70s chapter, an 80s chapter on the pattern and decoration movement. This will be a 90s chapter, and then I actually think there's probably a 2000s chapter that's reached calling my name somehow. But I'm trying to sort of hit these larger investments in histories of textiles, but it's not just about the process of making them, it's really about display, curatorial practice, and hierarchies in the art world. So I'm really sort of trying to touch on the idea of the cultural worker and what it means to do this kind of cultural work in regional spaces, what it means to be a woman doing that work primarily. And I feel like every time I show pieces of this work to students, they're shocked to know that the culture wars existed, because my students are all born in the 90s. So they don't know that these sort of histories and derisiveness precedes them, that they don't realize we're still having the same conversation 30 years later. So I feel like this is kind of a timely book that I would like to get out soon rather than sit on. But in terms of, like, I don't know. I have to maybe be chair of my department next year, so I don't know if that's going to slow me down or speed me up. But like 2 years or less, hopefully. Thank you. These catalogs are all out of print and hard to find, and when you do find them, save them, because also the binding at this time is that crappy, I don't know what it's called because I'm not a bookbinder, but it's like that kind of fake stitching that happens, and you open it and it cracks and all the pages fall out. I see a lot of nodding going on. And then you have to put a rubber band or some like binding thing, and that's all bad and acidic. Yes, binder clips are probably better, but librarians don't like those. Yeah. I would love to. I don't know that history, but I'm happy to learn it. Yeah, and I think that's. I mean, Kohler is a company town, right? This is the problem with capitalism, and also the problem with arts funding in our country is that we become very circularly dependent upon large corporations to fund the arts because we don't have any dependable private or public money that's coming in regularly, and so it becomes private funders who have their own investments in ultimately culture washing. Like if we think back to the 90s, the sort of most obvious example is the Whitney Museum in New York used to have a branch called the Whitney, sponsored by Philip Morris downtown. And that's a cigarette company. And they had to eventually close that because there was so much pushback about a cigarette company sponsoring the arts, but a whole museum in their atrium. But Philip Morris at the time sponsored all kinds of cultural things, especially the ballet companies. They were always the major funder for ballet in New York and elsewhere around the country. And guess what? Dancers smoke. Dancers smoke because they are trying not to eat. And so, artists smoke. I saw a little cigarette repository out here on the back. I don't know how many, Armando, you're Maybe you're the only smoker here, but it's a kind of vicious circle, and Philip Morris rebranded itself Altria, which I'm sure many of you know. And it has like a sort of series of colored abstract boxes as its logo, as a way to fully divorce itself from tobacco entirely. But the arts depends on private collectors, it depends on private lending, it depends on private patronage. I'm sure that this space is not immune from any of that, but this is like an ongoing problem in small spaces and in large ones around the country, is that because we have no public funding for the arts, we end up complicit in what you're saying, or these kinds of larger histories of violence, extraction, and bulldozing, essentially. And so I don't know how we escape that as a field, unless there's a wholesale movement toward doubling, tripling, or quadrupling the National Endowment for the Arts, which is, that would be amazing, but it depends. Every time there's an election cycle, it either goes up incrementally with the Democrats or it goes on the chopping block with the Republicans. If you look at the budgets, it's really been stagnant for the last 25 plus years, and the only major change was to redistribute its meager wealth to every single county in the country, which gets to decide how to spend. And so sometimes counties do it in really stupid ways, like cows on parade, which doesn't do anybody any good. Or public pianos, have you seen that project? Okay, so those are all NEA-funded public monies, and that is those particular counties and town arts councils deciding how they want to spend their NEA grant money, and nobody can say anything about that except to sort of, nod sadly. So. Yes, absolutely. That is the ultimate sort of expression of the culture wars, in which the visual arts permanently lost access to the individual artist grants from that. You can be a poet in this country and get an individual artist grant, and that's because I think Congress assumes nobody reads poetry. So you're not going to be that scary to a general public. But if you're a visual artist and you're making things in images, you're still too out there. So that's where we are. Yes?
I'm not an artist and like art. How would you kind of, like the elevator speech, sum up what your mission, what you told us here today, or what your purpose is, just in lay terms?
In lay terms, I am trying to provide access to what I believe is a forgotten history of group exhibition practice. So it's specific to, the kind of show that is on view here is a really rare example now of a group exhibition of, I don't know how many, maybe 15 artists. Did I get that right? Is it? Okay, about 13 to 15 artists who each have a work or two, sometimes just one, sometimes three, are brought together in a thematic way. Those shows used to be abundant all over the country. You used to be able to go into any of these kinds of regional spaces and see one of those, and I'm making the argument that it is textile-based sculpture, just like the one on view here. Textile-based practices driving this reach toward thinking about identity. Identity broadly being about sexuality, about gender, about race, about ethnicity, and that in doing work in textiles, you fly under the radar and don't alert the politicians who might come and be really happy to close down a show of full frontal nudity by Robert Mapplethorpe in photography, which is what happened in Cincinnati in a regional space in 1990. And its director put on trumped up on obscenity charges. So I think that we're in a real fear moment where that could potentially happen again in states where there's kind of MAGA warrior complex. And so I'm really interested in trying to think through problems of how the arts thrives and how it pushes forward a kind of agenda of difference in order to create spaces of inclusion, even though we were in a place where some of that inclusion and those diversity initiatives are now once again under fire in the same way that they were 30 years ago, that we have not really progressed. We are literally in a full circle moment institutionally, and my fear now is that curators in these kinds of spaces are also going to start becoming very threatened, isolated, and fearful for their jobs, for their funding, because arts funding in this country is so precarious. And because it takes a village literally to make these spaces thrive and continue on. But overall, I would say I'm a historian of gender and the visual arts, and I like to reclaim histories that other people aren't looking at. And to me, this is a kind of I don't know, a deep passion project. I was a student of Ann Wilson's at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. I worked in her studio after I graduated with a BFA. I have interacted with a lot of less the regional artists, but some of the major artists who are coming out of this moment, like Kiki Smith or Janine Antoni or Ann Hamilton, and I'm still sort of trying to figure out why, for instance, Kiki Smith got to have her career and Ann Wilson didn't get to have her career in the same way. Like, I'm trying to understand these equivalences that don't match up because they're doing works very similarly and just in different cities. And does it really mean that if you have decided to be a so-called regional artist, if Chicago is even a regional city in this country, which I would argue it's not, it's a major city, do you have to fly the coop and go to the coasts to have a big career? I don't think you do. And I think most people are, the opportunities for young artists are also in teaching positions around the country, and many people are educated in big cities and then move for a teaching position in some regional space, and they become the link for students to these other sort of centralized histories where they get introduced to like Mike Kelly or something. Like, it is those artists who are bringing the conceptual frameworks into those college classrooms or community college classrooms or regional art centers. So I guess I'm really interested in thinking about center periphery issues and also the way in which they become gendered, raced, and sort of classed. So I guess that's my pitch. It's a very academic answer to your question. But also I'm an art historian, so I think it's important to do deep work description for people and close visual analysis so that you understand why, these two works, what they're really trying to do, because these are conceptual artworks that are hard to interpret for people, like why you would actually frame this woman's hair this way. It's because she's rejecting the idea of traditional portraiture because she's facing with the back of her head instead of her face. And so once I explain that, it's really easy for people to get it, but it's not clear unless you put up a wall label. And this becomes one of the sort of stepping stone problems for lay people to understand conceptual art is without an interpretive and dynamic force explaining it to you, you don't know what you're looking at, and it sometimes makes people feel foolish or stupid and they walk away from it. And so that, I think, is one of the ways in which these kinds of spaces, like Bemis here, are key to doing that hardcore educational work to make people feel welcomed. They put videos up of the curator talking and interpreting the show. That's only happened in the last 10 years because it used to be you would walk in and feel kind of like, I don't know what's going on, and you'd have to go to the curator tour. Now there's all this media that people are comfortable with because they're used to, QR coding everything. So I think that that's also for me is this idea about the goodness and force of artists as an educational force, because I think artists ultimately want their work understood above all. Any artists want to second that or argue with it? The whole group of you in the back. I'm a US-based art historian. There are shows that happened like this. One of the primary venues was Exit Art in New York, which showed mostly international artists before the term global existed. But I think that the shows there were, they were thematic, but also they were nationalistic. And so I think that there's these other sets of issues that happened throughout the 90s. Sometimes people are doing, shows on Cuban exile. Sometimes they're doing shows about refugee status. And it doesn't mean people aren't using textiles. It just means that the theme becomes less about the material or the driving force. And so I think that I'm trying to limit my contain. You got to limit somewhere. So I'm trying to work through kind of like 85 to 2000, and I have 8 boxes in my studio upstairs to try to get through, like plow through tonight to see if I can locate. I haven't found a textile-driven show here yet, but it doesn't mean that there weren't textile-driven artists working in this space. What I've seen so far in the 90s here is that there were a lot of solo shows offered, and that also has to do with the residency program. That when you're linked to a residency program, artists are really keen to have their own show. I mean, I think that this is also something that's a kind of endless and permanent tension for art making and for artists, is the idea of, yes, you want to be in a group show with your peers, and at some point, mature artists get fed up with like always being a bridesmaid and never being a bride. And they want their own show by themselves in their own space to sprawl out. So.
And that, I think, relates to the fact that there was not a curator in this space. There was always like a director and support staff. But until Hesse was here, they didn't have a curator.
See, that's good information. I didn't even know that. But also because of all the organizational work that was happening on the ground here to fundraise, to keep this space going, to be able to give artists stipends, which was like a big deal, was to pay artists to be in residence here, to give them money to make their work is an amazing prospect in this country, to get money to do that and to not pay for the space yourself, which all of you benefit from, this long history. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Jenni.
Thank you.